Hello.
Hello.
Good
Hello.
evening.
Hello.
Michael's back. Yay!
Yay!
You've replaced our Italians.
Yeah.
Well, I can never truly replace them, but I'm definitely glad to finally be back.
Michael, tell everyone what you've been up to.
So I have been up to playing Joker, the film, live in concert. So we've been touring around the UK, and if Darren is on the stream, he actually came to the performance in Hammersmith, so he knows this. Yeah, we've been touring around with Hilder's score, which has been really very cool to do, especially the integration of live orchestra and so much sort of orchestral effects stemmed out with the live orchestra. So it's been really great. Great to get.
Very, very interesting topic for our hybrid score night.
Well, exactly.
Lots of quiet contrabassoon entries for you.
Lots of low, quiet contrabassoon and loud, low contrabassoon. So
You've covered the whole spectrum.
I've covered basically the full range of the instrument's abilities. So low and loud, low and quiet.
It's very cool.
Yeah, man, it's a good score.
It is good.
I remember thinking it was one of those. Well, I mean, the film's very unsettling, isn't it? But the score definitely helps that quite a lot.
It does. I mean, the sad thing is I've still not seen the film. I've heard the film so many times, and I have a general idea about what's going on, but I still have not actually watched it. So
you mean you didn't get to turn around?
Well, no, I was playing the whole time. So there, occasionally, depending on what stage we were on, there was we were sat out in front of the screen. A lot of the time we were behind it, so I couldn't actually see. But I've looked up specific scenes on YouTube where I was particularly confused, just so I could know the context. But seems like a great film, so I will absolutely watch it at some point soon.
Oh, it's definitely worth the watch. The Joaquin Phoenix is ace. Dead creepy in that. And very sad as well.
Well, I didn't think he was the ace. I thought he was the Joker.
You know, we're not just among friends now.
It's okay.
That was actually pretty good.
I know.
I feel like we underreacted.
If you'd posted that in our chat, Michael, you'd have got a superb for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, guys, today we're going to listen to some synthesized / processed music. What does that mean? I don't know what it means. So you tell me what it means. What does well, I mean, I don't know how much sort of processed music we're going to get. I feel like I used that word, not really knowing what I meant by it.
Mm-hmm. But and I think many people probably feel that way.
Yeah, and in many ways, I regret it as a result.
Well, I think, I mean, sort of broadly, when we talk about like hybrid music, or anybody, we as film composers, I think a lot of people, especially coming from sort of a more classically trained background, are a bit daunted by what that is or could be, because it feels like, ooh, I need to somehow like integrate synths in with orchestral writing. But I think personally, this is kind of how I think about it. Like, you've had the orchestra for hundreds of years, and it's this whole like broad world of color. But then all of a sudden in the late 20th century, you have synths, and it's sort of this whole new world of color that's constantly evolving. So it can do things that an orchestra can't, like a clarinet can have a range of timbre, but it can never not sound like a clarinet, or it can never sound like a violin. Whereas synths can have like such a broad range of timbre, and can really like glide across that spectrum very fluidly. So I think that's something they're really good at, and that's a really interesting thing of sort of combining them.
I think you may have scratched a Michael orchestration scab there.
Oh no! I was just.
It did sound like a sigh.
No! It was all right.
Michael got triggered already.
No! It was the fact you said. A clarinet can never sound like a violin. I said, well, you've clearly never heard a beginner clarinet. That's what immediately sprung to mind. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Oh well, you have, Sam,
for many years.
I was gonna say, just on the subject of like, I think it's interesting, the processed part of it, because it makes me think that there kind of exists more of a gradient. You can tell me what you guys think of this, where if you're trying to recreate an acoustic sound by recording it with a microphone, and your goal is to display that sound to the listener unchanged, then I think you're attempting to showcase that acoustic sound. But the moment you start manipulating it through processing or reamping it or stretching it or applying effects to it, you are now in a different world, right? You're creating something that the listener knows it could feel cannot be experienced in a conventional acoustic way.
Now, here's the question for you, Shane. With something like that, with something like a more simplistic processing, like with something like reverb or even EQ, I feel like there's a certain degree to where that still maintains its acoustic integrity and it's not processed. But then again, you get something like black hole reverb, which is huge and massive. And if you apply that to a sound, you could argue that that's a processed sound. So is there a point in which it switches over from one to the other, or is this sort of a blurred line?
In my opinion, I don't think there is. You should think of it that way in terms of the gradient, because I totally know what you mean. If you apply just a little bit of EQ to fix something, to make it sound more real, then, you know, that's one thing. Whereas if you apply an EQ with the intent to make it sound like nothing else we've heard before, then that's very different intent. So I think it comes down to, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve realism, or are you trying to achieve something different?
I think that's why, you know, just to retrospectively justify my use of the word process, I think that's maybe what I was getting at, is that seeing the word synthesized feels more clear cut, and actually I think we want to cover, yes, something that is purely electronic, that is a manipulated sine wave, to stuff that starts off completely organic, completely acoustic, and is then altered, and everything in between. And that's kind of what we're getting at, is that it's stepping away from, you know, the discipline of maybe just orchestration and seeing what you then do. And I think what Mike was saying is that thinking of it as just another you know, array of tools for the tool belt, another way of thinking about sound. You know, it's quite an interesting thing. I think, you know, certainly me and Michael have a background in pushing what the orchestra does as a priority, and so maybe limited in thinking. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Michael, but certainly for me, maybe limited in thinking in the sort of plug-in terms from the start, like, wouldn't it be great to take this instrument and do this to it? You know, I have to force myself to think that way a lot of the time. So yeah, it's just an interesting and important approach, certainly now, to think of scores in a hybrid way, and you know, it sort of makes your palette pretty infinite, really. Yeah, shall we listen to something, guys?
Yeah, just before we do, if I just want, you make me think of something there, Sam. I suppose it was kind of like a false sort of dichotomy that I mentioned a moment ago, because the truth is, the moment you digitize any sound, the moment you record anything, you're making so many decisions that like alter it, and you know, you're recording it from a certain vantage point with a certain microphone, you know, whatever the case may be. So it's kind of like maybe the hybrid approach is to just accept everything that is recorded can be manipulated. So why stop at X? You know, why not push it to a different level? Why not do something else? So maybe that's a freeing way to think about it, is like, I've recorded something, but it doesn't have to stop there.
I mean, it's very much a recorded art form, what we're doing. I mean, despite, you know, what Michael's been hard at work doing, performing it live for the last few weeks, you know, composers do approach it as a recorded thing. You know, becomes zeros and ones, and you can do what you want to it. Which one first? Should we listen to Hookah's, or watch rather?
Yeah, and
done, Mike?
Yeah, well, Hooker, why don't you tell us a bit about it? So we know this is a clip from the animated film Sky Blue, and yeah, why don't you tell us a bit about kind of your approach to it while we sort of watch through? You can just type in the comments, and yeah, and just kind of let us know sort of what any questions too, if you feel like there's anything like, hey, I sort of attempted this, but I'm not really sure about it or anything. Just kind of open up, I guess.
Great. Okay, mute yourselves, guys, and I'll let it play.
How long has it been raining? Forever. Not forever. No. For 100 years. They say billions of people once lived on the Earth. When the temperatures rose, the great cities fell, and this rain came. This terrible, toxic rain. Ancestors saw it coming. A catastrophe. They built Ecobon, the first living city, genetically engineered to survive in a poisonous environment. Survivors came by the thousands, begging to be let in. But our ancestors turned them away, left them to die in the wasteland. The ones who survived became our workers, mining the carbonite fields to feed our ecobon. Diggers, we call them. The diggers need us. We need them. Everybody wins. But some win more than others.
Well done, guys.
Yeah.
Cool. There we go.
Really nice.
Yeah,
Nice
cool.
one.
Nice work.
Oh, let's read what Hugo said. I didn't read it. So, use banging 808s. Good start. Mix synths, heavy percussion and strings, missing a few hit points. I'd like to know if this approach works in general. I'm also layering a bunch of weird woodwinds and cinewinds, try to create some futuristic, another world type of sound that you hear in the beginning and in the end. Okay, thanks for that. Oh, and choir. Yes. Love the choir.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's really cool. I mean, to answer your question, does this work? Does this approach work in general? Yes, I'd say so. I think also that's a good use of kind of woodwinds, you know, and actually sort of relating back to last week, we sort of talked about this. I think that approach would have been much better on Dune instead of a Duduk. And, you know, using, or bagpipes for that matter, but kind of using something that was a bit more processed, or, you know, could have, like, there was an opportunity to create a really interesting new sound. Sorry, Shane, go ahead.
Like just when you mentioned bagpipes, it sounded like I heard the Uilleann pipes, the Irish pipes there at the end. Maybe my ear is wrong, but so just funny bagpipe thing. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that is really cool. And kind of when sort of processing, you know, or something, it's like, I think something that synths are really good at, that I was sort of alluding to earlier, is that, you know, you can shift timbre and make changes over such a wide range, and to kind of, you have the opportunity to always have that sound moving. And I compare it to like if a cellist is performing a line, they're also always sort of adapting and shifting the timbre in their performance. And that's what makes a really brilliant performance sort of stand out. So it's sort of like we have to do the same stuff with synthesized or processed sounds so that they, we need to kind of perform them in that way. So I think you could maybe even push that a little bit further to make it kind of a unique sound. And I might suggest also in general, I think you've got kind of nice ideas and sort of the structure is very clear of the picture, but maybe trying to smooth those together a little bit because some of the different shifts and changes seemed a little abrupt. But so again, kind of use the instruments to their advantage that you can have this sort of blending of timbre of sound sort of from one to the other, or even with some of that percussive stuff. Like you could have it not just sort of fade in volume wise, but also fade in like with a filter or something like that. So that sound sort of evolves and becomes kind of where the starting point is now. So just some thoughts.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that, Mike. I think, yeah, great job, Hugo. I think I loved your ideas. I mean, I think every thing you had going on for each section made total sense, and it was interesting as well. For me, I don't know if you guys were hearing this, and I don't know if it's sort of a downsizing with video or whatever, or just the volume on OBS, but I felt like Hugo, you did a really good job of space, but not size. I thought, I think you can be bolder with making things sound massive. For me, it sounded like it was nicely placed, and it had that sense of space, but it sounded a bit sort of airy, and I don't know. I feel like maybe just taking a look at the EQ and lifting some of the bass and getting it nice and fat sounding, massive drums, and just being super bold with it as well. Like, I mean, your ideas are pretty bold already, but like really pushing them. Just as a disclaimer to that, I agree with what Laura's saying. I realise this is more of a spotting thing, but it certainly it is clashing occasionally with the dialogue, and just being careful. I don't think it's an issue of volume, because it's the sort of music that can still work well when dubbed low, but just being careful not to make it too busy. I think if it gets too busy, that's when it becomes more of an issue with the dialogue, and because it's a voiceover, you're not seeing mouths move. It's even more sensitive. So yeah, I think for me, the only thing I wanted is more depth to it, more oomph, because you've got a really nice sense of open space which works with the video, but it's also quite an epic scene setting that's going on, and like big buildings, big caves, make us really feel like it's heavy as well, is really what I was after.
I think just to tag onto that, I think a lot of that depth could also just be achieved with reverb. It's all kind of dry. Like it's there's definitely reverb, but I think as far as making it massive, like you could imagine this in a much bigger cave or aircraft hangar or something like that, with those drums, and see how far you could sort of push that back with them still being present. So I think you could definitely do that with this.
Yeah, or perhaps just have a few elements that give the sense of something being further away so that we feel like there's more contrast. It feels like things are quite close to us, personally.
Yeah, definitely not everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Choosing those moments is another nice creative axis to work along.
Yeah, I think I think what that will help you with as well. You mentioned a couple of hit points. I realise this isn't specific to what we're talking about, but by doing that, you'll also give yourself more space to see what's getting in the way, if that makes sense. There was one bit in particular where there's a hit point, just the end of a phrase that she says towards the beginning, and then you kind of hit quite hard straight after that, and it just feels slightly early. to me. And I think when you have even more space between things, when you've got everything, taking up even more space, even more size, that'll become really obvious. And I think you'll really feel that, because you'll be like, oh, actually, that's just a bit too early. But yeah, for sure, just having that more contrast as well, like the guys are saying, a good idea.
My thoughts, if I can go next, was I really liked the opening, the initial synth textures you had there, all the different elements that had like the really fast tremolo effect. I thought that was really cool. Although I would experiment maybe with, like, depending on how you're achieving that, like maybe lowering the depth of the tremolo a little bit. Just something to try, because I often find, like, if I have like a tremolo at like 100%, it's really choppy. Maybe that's the effect you're going for. So I wouldn't say like do it. I'm just saying, like, think about trying it. But then I don't know. I felt like after we had the title screen, this is more of a spotting thing, but like with the drums and everything, it was very intense for what we were seeing on screen. And you had those super strong contrasts between like when the drums were playing and then they weren't. Up to you about your kind of spotting decisions about that, but that's just how it came across to me, as being a very, very sharp contrast between the two. And maybe, as Mike was saying, like with filtering elements in and out, you could connect them. And that leads me on to the other thing that I thought, which was that I felt very much like I was in the electronic world from the beginning, and then after the title card, definitely in the electronic world. But when we jumped to more strings and brass and stuff, they got a little bit left behind, it felt to me. So maybe there would be a way to integrate them and be like, okay, we're having orchestral music now, but it's got still some synth elements in there. Like a perfect example would be when your short string passage comes in. If you double that on like a short synthesizer, like a poly synth, that even it can be low in the mix, but it makes your strings sound thicker and more modern and less orchestral. And it might just put that section of music in the same world as the rest of the cue. But yeah, I mean, I thought it was very successful overall. But yeah,
I agree, Shane, with that last point, because I had a thought that for me it was there's a horn part, or certainly a brass part, where I felt you needed to either lean into the organic sound of the brass more, or you need to process it more to make it blend. I think it was kind of a halfway house where it kind of just sounded slightly flat samples, but if you did more to it and made it more of something, just either more horny, as it were, or more sort of grainy or something.
Yeah, well, that was I pulled that bit up just now and was listening in my headphones as you were talking about it, and I think Mike was right earlier that a lot of it could be helped with reverb, and specifically that horn bit came up just as you said that, and it does to me, that in particular sounds like a sample, and if it were given a little bit more of room for realism in actual sort of acoustical space instead of being so flat, I think it would automatically make it sound so much better, and maybe also taking away some of the upper frequencies, because it just sounds very. Maybe the whole aim was to have it sound very sort of overly processed, sort of, late 90s, early 2000s Zimmer horn sound. But I feel like if you took away some of that top and maybe beefed up a little bit of the bottom, either through reverb or EQ, that would make it sound a lot more homogenized with everything else that's going on.
Well, I wonder if it's a case of taking away some of the highest frequencies in the synthesized stuff to make it sound really fat, and then things like the horns, if you want them to sound organic, to keep the high frequencies in there, keep the air in the airy instruments. Maybe that'll give it some separation. I don't know.
I mean, I think a lot of it, a lot could be helped by especially beefing up the lower strings. As I was listening to that section again, like the basses and the cellos, whatever's going on there, just make it sound like a nice warm bed that the rest of the orchestra can sit on, only just because it felt relatively unsupported compared to before, as Shane said, when the drums dropped out. It sort of felt like the entire bottom dropped out, despite the fact that you have such low strings continuing to play. If you beefed up that a little bit, maybe the horns wouldn't feel as upfront as they are right now. So just maybe add a little bit more warmth to the overall orchestral sound, just starting with the bottom, I think would help a lot.
Can you guys think of any, I mean, not to over influence what Hookah's doing, but I mean, immediate reference for me is like Blade Runner 2049 and things like that, that just to listen to get an idea of, the kind of size and mixing to aim for, like just as a reference. Do you guys think that's worth doing.
I mean, I think that's a good one. But also I was gonna suggest too, just thinking in terms of like what you can do to each of these. Like it's not just in the way of like orchestral doubling, kind of like, okay, I could also double this sound with a synth sound too. You could also blend like how those come in and out of one another. You can make that a really dynamic texture. I mean, in a like purely orchestral way, this is something that like Ravel does really well. Is like has a texture sort of creep in and creep out and is constantly evolving. But you could also do things like if you're using sort of delay and stuff like that, play with the space. So you can have that delay like ping ponging back and forth, play with the panning. You can have these sounds sort of moving around the stereo space too. So it doesn't also have to just be kind of static, like everything sits in a kind of chair on stage. All of this can move around. So if you start to think about that, like, oh, I have this sound, and then now I have it with some delay, and now I have it ping ponging around, and I have that ping ponging sound sort of ducking in and out with another sound that's doing something different, that whole texture becomes really dynamic and can really kind of grab the ear. And it's simple things. It's just kind of combining those ideas and thinking about like, what else could I do with this sound?
Yeah, like alternating all those parameters for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing with synths. Like automating stuff just does so much work. It's amazingly powerful. I was also just listening to it again. I forgot I could do that. I really love the textures you have in the first like 40 seconds. I think in retrospect, like I'm sad to kind of hear them go. I don't really like there's this beautiful guitar color. It sounds like a guitar that I feel like, if you've set up a sound world of certain elements that are really working, maybe don't just like abandon them. They could reoccur even in a smaller way, but to just bring some unity to the whole thing. It's kind of what I said before, but I just wanted to specifically that sound at like 30 seconds or so is so great. And when you have the like open shot of kind of like the plains with the the gray clouds and the distant mountains or whatever, you really have a great sense of space there in terms of how you've kind of taken your time with the movement of the music. And yeah, I wondered, like, is there any way to bring some of that sense of space later on? Maybe it's not appropriate. Anyway, I'll shut up.
It's a good point, Shane. I think it's important to keep it that continuity for sure, because we never actually leave the broader setting, do we? Apart from the title card, so it's actually keeping that continuity is a good idea, I think, for sure. Yeah, but I mean, really, really great job, Hugo. I mean, really cool ideas going on there.
Yeah, nice one. Should we jump on to Lara's?
Let's do Lara's. Yeah, absolutely. You got the link, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Mute yourselves, please. You are on camera. All good.
Cool.
All good. Really
Lovely,
nice.
lovely
Yeah,
stuff,
very nice
Laura.
work.
Really good.
Really awesome
And
piece.
you have the Icelandic approval from Hooker.
Yeah, thanks for letting us know a bit of background on that, Laura. Really interesting stuff. I really love the sound of this. I thought, the size here, Hooker actually is a good one to have listened to straight after yours. This, just based on what I was saying about yours, because what Laura's got here is a real kind of breadth. You can really feel the kind of, there's a bit of weight there. I only had one thought about this, Laura, really, and that's when you get to your climax to slap more reverb on it. It felt quite abrupt, and like we've had that real breadth and size all the way through, and then it feels for me not satisfying enough to have such a short tail. I realise that it may be synced and that you wanted to get the cello solo back in, but just let that kind of, it'll make that hipped that climax point just kind of spread and wash over what's left. I think it'll be, for me, that would make it more satisfying. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I feel like we could just like bathe in the beauty of that decay for like a second or two, and then the cello comes out, and then it's like a beam of light. Whereas at the moment, it's kind of like, yeah, the strings kind of just die down, and then the cello's there, and it's lovely, but it could be lovelier.
Yeah, I have to say, because oh, sorry, Shane. I was just going to say
No, you
quickly
go.
on that, because obviously the piece is called Crescendo, and obviously maybe I'm a little distracted looking at the waveform, but I was expecting to see it sort of grow a lot more than it actually did in terms of the sound. And I think you're right in saying that reverb at the end, if it were to grow and expand, it would give it this expansiveness that would give the illusion of it suddenly getting almost much more warm and louder, and sort of immersing ourselves fully in the sound. I think you're spot on. It would sound really nice there. I think it was a really good suggestion, guys. So I completely agree with you.
I was going to say about this piece, I think it's really good, really lovely. And I really like the synth color that, grows and goes away. It's kind of got, it feels kind of old and analog-y in a really nice, warm way. So kudos to you for capturing that. I think that's great. And I love the kind of just the simple, well, I won't say simple in a bad way, like the simple concept of the piece of you've kind of got like the synth grows and goes away, and then the cello plays a phrase, and then the synth grows and goes away. It's just really like, it works really effectively. The only thing that kind of I didn't like was sort of related to what Michael was just saying about the growth. I feel like where we get to is great by whatever the timestamp is. Well, you can look at the waveform, 145 or whatever. Where we get to is great, but I feel like we could start with so much less. Like, and I'm thinking specifically of the string tremolo texture. I would like it to have changed more in some way, and I think that you could do that in a number of ways. You could have different playing styles moving, over the fingerboard at the beginning and then coming more towards the bridge by the end or something. But really, I think you could have also just achieved it with making it much quieter and less intense at the beginning, and slowly growing in a kind of inexorable way. So by the time we get to the end, it's like really powerful. Whereas I feel like almost from second one, the tremolo is strong and it's there and you hear it and it stays with you the whole way. It's not like it spoiled the piece for me. I still think it's a really great piece, but analyzing it, I think that end would have been so much more satisfying if you had taken us there bit by bit by bit by bit.
Just to piggyback quickly off that, Shane, what you mentioned about the trems. Laura, you mentioned Oliver Arnolds as an inspiration for your synth patch. I wonder if you have his Spitfire samples, because he has some pretty good Evo libraries. And if you want something that's kind of subtly or less subtly changing over time, they're really good for that. So even just like doubling, as the chord kind of spreads towards the climax, I don't know. I apologize if you knew this already, but the sort of matrix that creates the sound, according to a position in the grid, it can evolve differently. So as you add notes, those notes will be changing more, perhaps more starkly and more obviously, which could be a really nice thing to blend into what you have here, as opposed to I think they are just trends, aren't they? Which is really nice at the start, but and yeah, I completely agree, Shane, with what you said about dropping it at the start. It starts quite hot, doesn't it? And actually keeping it fluffy.
I mean, in an ideal world, if we could do whatever we wanted, and maybe that was way outside the scope of this, but I can imagine this working really effectively with a string section where kind of the changes in timbre come about from very subtle, very small changes, whether it be, you know, the trem speed or the dynamics or the number of people playing. You know, you start with the back desks and you bring them in and they start off playing flautando and there's not much bow pressure, and then they start playing faster with more bow pressure, and they start, you know, like those tiny little changes in sound, and you introduce more players. I think that would be a really cool way to, and there's ways to fake it as well, but yeah, that I know I'm harping on about it, but just that one element, because everything else is so nice.
Well, it almost feels like it should be emerging or coming from the distance, doesn't it? Starting off far, and then as the piece gets on, it gets closer and closer, and maybe a little bit more realized and more detail is seen. In fact, this, Laura, I don't know if you are familiar with the game. Shane, you might know, but the game Inside, have you played it before?
I haven't.
There's one specific track that reminds me. No, not Bo Burnham, not a Netflix special, but no, it's Inside. I think it's the developers Play Dead or something, but it's a very beautiful platformer game, and there's one particular track that reminds me a lot of this, not in a derivative way, but you know, in a very complementary way, and it starts off very distant, and sort of elements that are very not quite in focus start coming in and increasing in volume, and as they seemingly increase in volume, they get a little bit more defined, and it's almost like you're sort of turning the lens of a camera and the image is getting slightly more focused as you're zooming in, and it's a really beautiful effect overall, because it also has this very sort of almost stagnant yet sort of alive chord that's being sustained the entire time during the track, and I think that would be a very cool effect to be able to recreate, is to give it a sense of distance and traveling, even though it's a very somewhat static sound.
Do you know the track, Michael? Laura's asking.
Oh, the track is called, I think it's called Shockwave, from the Inside soundtrack. But here, let me see. Can I drop it in the chat? Hold on.
Yeah. While he's doing that, Mike, did you have anything?
Oh wait, I can't do it.
No, I mean, I agree with everything. I mean, that was kind of my only point too, and I think obviously we're not seeing this sync to picture. So maybe it needed to kind of start big, but I think you could also achieve that like with a sense of space and volume while still allowing for this sort of range of detail. And another thought is that even without the ability to, you know, maybe depending on kind of how you are approaching this, you can approach some of those effects in a processed way as well as like a naturally orchestrated way. So there's a track on my album where I did this with some of the choir, where I had them record like a phrase with sort of like open oohs. And then I also had the same phrase recorded with like humming. And then it happens over like 8 bars. And then I just crossfaded those over 8 bars. So it's this very long crossfade where it digitally gradually goes from like a closed mouth hum to an open mouth ooh. And it created a really nice effect. So there's things like that too, where you could sort of blend some of those textures in post. It's just another idea.
That's a nice idea. I had a quick question actually, Laura. Is the video, has the video got any sound with it? So are there like sounds of waves and stuff like that? And if not, because I mean that obviously affects sort of spectral decisions as well. But if not, it might be a bit trite, but that's something that can work with a climax as well. The immediate example I'm thinking of is another Hans Zimmer one in Interstellar. If you know Dreaming of the Crash, there's this whole scene where it has a lot of sound design in it of wind and stuff, and it just really builds in this sort of it's like it's clipping really strongly, and just incorporating that could be a nice that kind of idea of a blend of sound design and synths could be an interesting one as well. But yeah, really successful, that Laura. I think that's
very
that's
nice
a great
track.
Really cool.
If anyone else has any tracks, feel free to share along. Otherwise, we've got some of ours that we can look at.
Yeah, let's open one of yours, mine.
I was actually thinking, Sam, based on kind of what we've been covering, maybe we look at a track from my album.
Oh, cripes,
we could look at, which is maybe Spotify is just the easiest way.
Oh, Jolene says she just sent one.
Cool.
Oh,
In your email, apparently.
And my email. Why don't you share that link in the chat if you can? I think it'll be faster for us.
Not sure it will. How do I get to the chat? Oh, I've got to go on Twitch. Oh, this is where everyone finds out how much of a klutz I am.
Jolene, do send it through. It's going to take me a minute.
No,
please do,
Jolene,
yes.
please, we'd prefer to listen to yours than mine.
No.
I would.
This is what happens, you see.
That's all right. While you guys are doing that, I was just a thought that's been in the back of my mind during this entire stream has just been sort of the role of synth integrated into orchestra. It almost brings the orchestral sound into the modern era. I was just thinking about this as I was coming back on the train today when I was listening to even John Williams, which, you know, Sam and I are absolute diehard fans for. The modern era, anything for him. But the it does, like, just orchestral sounds, it does have a somewhat dated sound, and even just adding slight synths underneath it can really add a modern sound to it and can really bring the palette into the 21st century and really update it. I was thinking, you know, the fact that there's not consistent even drums under most of what John Williams does makes it sound somewhat dated. Not that it's a bad thing, but you know, is the role of
actually
synths
quite refreshing though. Sometimes.
What's that?
I said it's quite refreshing to not have drums under every.
No, and I don't mean consistent drums or anything like that, but you know what I mean, is that sort of up close, sort of hyper produced sound. So it is really refreshing when you're able to integrate true orchestral playing with really good synth work. It creates a really unique experience, I think. Oftentimes it's too much one or too much of the other, but I don't know. Do you guys know of any Jerry Goldsmith stuff from like the 80s? Like, do you know the Explorer soundtrack? The Explorers, a film from it's good. It's like it's 1980s synths, but it's very tasteful integration of synths into an orchestral texture. Not as nuanced as you'd have nowadays, but it's definitely worth a listen to for sure.
Well, he's a great example of kind of orchestrating with that as just another set of tools, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but you know, it's now sounds it sounds somewhat dated because of the progress in mixing, etc.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is that Goldsmith sort of treated synths almost like an orchestral instrument, whereas nowadays a lot of people treat the orchestra like a synth instrument in some ways. And so it's just interesting to see that sort of flip.
By a lot of people, we know who you're talking about.
You're not kidding. Guys, I've got this video ready if we want to watch it.
As do I.
From Jolene. Okay, here we go. You've got the link, have you guys?
Oh, hold on. The one in the chat?
From Jolene, yeah.
Yep. Let me mute myself.
Okay, here we go. Great.
Yeah, very cool.
Cool. Nice work, Jolene.
Nice one, Jolene. All
Hey,
right,
Jolene,
I get to read it.
I was going to ask, out of curiosity, while Sam's reading that, were you doing overtone singing in there, or was that just modified singing normally? It sounded like you were doing some, and I'm just really fascinated about that. So let me know.
Can I jump in straight away, guys?
Yeah, go ahead.
Which I keep doing. I'm sorry, but I you know what I'm like. Yeah, really great stuff, Jolene. I think again you have some really interesting ideas that were positioned really spotted, I should say, really well. I'd be interested to know if you dubbed this or they dubbed it, because my immediate thought is someone's been very cruel to your sound, to your score, and it should be twice the volume for most of that. There's no dialogue. The sound effects are secondary, in my opinion, and you should be way louder. You know, there's and if well, okay, there you go. They dubbed it, and that doesn't surprise me because they're student filmmakers, and in my experience of working with student filmmakers, they're less experienced at knowing where to bring score up, you know, how to dub basically. But you've got such great stuff there. Sorry, such great stuff there that it loses a little bit of identity by not being dubbed higher in the mix. And certainly, you know, like at the very beginning, you introduce these ideas, and I'm listening for it. And I think there are moments where you shouldn't have to listen for it. You're telling the story as much as the animation is. The animation is lovely, you know, it's done in a really, really cool way, and I think you capture something in your music. But I'm listening for it a lot, and I think it needs to be. I don't know if you guys agree with that, but I think it's way too quiet. I also, the only other thought I had, well, only other two thoughts. Firstly, I loved your piano music in the credits, and wanted that, you know, retrospectively, I wanted to hear that earlier. It felt like more of a theme, and I realised that we're talking about the synthesized elements, but just maybe even bookending it with some of that a bit more would have been nice.
I had a thought on that specifically, if I could jump in. Like one way that you could also kind of incorporate that is having it heavily processed. So then by the time we hear it in the credits, it's kind of like a reveal. So you could even have some of that piano like in various bits, maybe reversed and heavily processed as part of that sound design, or heavily time stretched or something like that, so that kind of color is already introduced to us. So then when we hear it in the end credits, it's like, oh, that's what it is. And I think that could be really cool. Anyway, go on, Sam.
I just, well, on that, I mean, the piano as a result ends up being a beautiful piece, but not representative of anything in the film. And it makes total sense to have it as end credits if it's, a thing that's heard earlier. My only other thought was that, generally being bolder, but also, and I don't know how much of that was the dubbing or whatever, but there's a really nice bit where things get a bit hectic in her mind, and you do really interesting things with panning and automating volume and stuff like that. And I felt like there were some other elements throughout that were kind of dynamic as well, and just felt more static. I feel like you let things out a bit more at that moment, but I think just keeping, you were asking about whether it's too repetitive. No, I don't think so. I think you've been quite subtle in scoring it. I think what you can do is just add a little bit more evolution to the sound, maybe, in each section, and things like panning certain things. You can just have it be quite subtle, because I think the idea of the film is to be just have a sense of unease a lot of the time, and there's a note of melancholy going on, yes, but also just we need to be unsettled with the main character and not quite sure of how we should feel. And I think you can do a little bit more with the dynamism of the sounds you're using, because they were otherwise fairly static, I think, for me. I think you made the right choices in the sounds you were using, but yeah, for me it could just shift and ebb and flow just a little bit more. But yeah, for me it was mostly the dubbing thing. I just wanted to hear it louder. I don't know if you guys.
There's one other bit with kind of the climactic bit before she smashes the pot, I think, and where that uses the director's voice. And I think that part, it's such a strong sound and kind of part of the sound design that sticks out. Actually, you cut it off like a couple seconds before the climax. And so it was almost like it felt like it was misaligned with the climax. So I think kind of in general, if you have like a build like that and it's all sort of going there, and especially with a particularly strong sound, then I think that should sort of carry through to the end. And it would help that feel a little bit more fluid and kind of complete. It's so that it's because it was so strong, and then that cut out, and then a second and a half later, the rest of it cut out. It felt almost like there was two climaxes. So I think just keeping that sort of in line and would help it stay smooth.
Yeah, I agree. And just while we're on the subject of that build, I thought there would have been an opportunity maybe to do a little bit more with that build, just because I'm kind of reacting to what I'm seeing visually, and it gets very intense and very disconcerting and very, pushing the audience away. And the music doesn't quite match it, in my opinion. And I think one of the ways to make it work would because it feels like it's getting louder and more intense, and then it stops, and then some other kind of whooshing sound happens, and then the smash. Either have everything build all the way up to the smash and land on it, or just before, like everything's going crazy, and then smash. Like have that moment of silence. Like that could have really made it more impactful. I was going to say, just on the subject of the whole film, I thought it was like really effective at making the audience feel like unease, and I had nothing emotionally to grab onto, and I felt really pushed away. And I think that you achieved that very well with the sounds that you chose and the way you treated them. I do feel like personally, and this is very subjective, I would have liked to have a little bit of contrast to that. Give me something at some moment so that I can feel I'm connected, so that then you take it away. It's one of those things where it's like, if everything's big, nothing's big. If everything's pushing the audience members away, I can't grab onto anything. That's very much like a decision, you know, to be discussed with the
Maybe-
director, but I would have liked that personally.
Maybe the piano is something that can be useful in that regard as well, because that's kind of, for me, it has emotional value that is wasted in the credits. I mean, it's not wasted in the credits, but you know what people are like in cinemas if they're not going to watch the credits. So bring it in. I think you're talking about silence, Shane, but I think there's merit in using those.
I wasn't quite
think-
talking about silence. I was talking more about the language of the music, like having some more musical language that I can connect to, because
Yeah.
you know, a
Did
lot
you
of the
feel that
sounds
with the
were.
piano, though? At the
Yeah, I
end?
mean, I would have connected to the piano if it was used earlier.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
But
yeah.
I'm not advocating that it like definitely put the piano in. I just mean even just like, you know, a synth sound that is like a warm fifth or something. So I'm like, oh, something I can latch onto. I'm not saying it has to be a melody, it has to be strings, it has to be piano. I'm not trying to say that, because I understand there's other ways to communicate with music than just those traditional ways. But yeah, I just felt like every sound I heard made me feel like you don't understand this the whole way from the beginning to the end. And that's what I felt.
I mean, I think a nice moment where that could happen is also kind of maybe when she's planting the seeds, because this then, like, the plant becomes a character within the film. So it's like if everything else is shown as kind of part of this mundane life, and then this moment is like the thing that brings joy, and you just give a glimpse of that warmth, then it will also be impactful when it's destroyed. And so I think that could be a really nice time to just sort of tie that in, and then we feel like it really matters.
Yeah, I think just on that point, and also your comment, Jolene, you've said you need to play with silence more, but it's very easily interpreted wrongly there. I don't think we're necessarily saying more silence. I think you're actually quite sparse with the music you're using. I think what Shane and Mike are saying is that we lack a little bit of a journey with the emotional. There is an emotional journey, emotional arc happening, an ebb and flow throughout the film, and I think what you've done is probably very deliberately scored the unsure moments and the ambiguous moments with those synths, and actually it's more effective. I think this is what you're saying, Mike, if we have that immediate contrast of like what is meaningful to this character. The plan.
I don't think it needs to be necessarily immediate, but that, like, just, it could be done in a very subtle way where it's just sort of snuck in and out, or very gradually brought in and out. But I think those things can highlight it, because whether you do something sort of immediately or have a stark contrast to something can also show like how quickly or how much you want to draw attention to a particular moment. Just knowing that you should draw attention to a particular moment, that in itself, the way you approach that is then up to you and kind of within the context of how you do it. But just knowing, like, if you mark one moment from being different from the others, then that will help give us that arc. So we kind of feel like, with the example with the plant, it's like, oh, now here is something that like is very important and really brings a lot of joy, and is sort of like a friend to someone who really struggles to express themselves, and then, feels the urge to kind of destroy this and sort of self-sabotage that. Then that shows that journey, whether it's done really subtly or very directly, is kind of up to you and the director.
Yeah, and just last thing I'll say before I shut up, just what Jolene just said, which was she was trying to add less emotion due to the theme of the film. And I think you really achieved that. And I actually think it's very brave to do what you did, to like use all of that musical language where it's like, it is very, it gives us nothing to grab onto. So I'm not trying to say like, you were wrong or whatever. I'm just trying to say, for me, from my experience of watching the film, in my opinion, I would have really liked to have been brought in as an audience member, to feel like I'm, it's really hard to put into words. I think I guess just what I said earlier. I'll be quiet.
I think you're right, and I actually think that it's so easy to overscore a film like this, and I think you were very astute, very sensible to not do that, to avoid doing that, and I suspect that comes from conversations with the filmmaker as well, because they tend to not want their things overscored, in my experience. But I think just with your position as, you know, head of what music can do for this film, you need to be like, right, what is the purpose of my music here, and how, and because it's a short form thing, you have to do a lot in a short space of time, and so you have to distill those purposes right down, and that's what I think Shane and Mike are saying, is to do that they need to be quite potent in a way. You can be quite sparse and you can be subtle, but what the music is actually achieving, that's the trick, is taking us through that journey, grabbing us by the tie and just, you know, pulling us through that story. And I think
You don't wear ties, Sam.
sorry, private school guys, sorry. But I think we're all kind of saying the same thing in a slightly different way, so I hope that's clear what we're getting at, Jolene. We think what you've done is good. It's just really distilling it down. It's so hard in short film. I always found it very hard to like get that narrative bang on musically and do just what you need to do without doing too much or too little. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's actually easier in many ways in long form, because you have time to develop your themes. You have time to for a motif or theme to to become attached to a character or thing. But in a short film, you have to do it in a very short space of time. So yeah, hopefully it all makes sense. Guys, 9:05. Do we have any more to add?
Not really.
No. Wow.
I think I've failed to say what I was trying to say enough. I think I should stop now.
Oh, I think you said it right.
No, I came across.
Thank you guys for sharing, though. We
Yeah, thanks,
appreciate
everyone.
you sharing your work with us, and it's great to see. It's very nice work, everyone, as well.
Yeah, pleasure, guys. Thank you. And you know, same deal again in a couple of weeks, where we'll be doing like sound design specific music. So music incorporating lots of sound design, as distinct from processed music. Yeah.
If you're, curious, just because we brought it up, we could play quickly through one of the tracks of my album, just to tell you kind of what's going on in it. Because it was one that I had recorded brass sort of separately as an overdub, and then reversed them in the sort of final mix. And then also there was a very interesting sort of plugin that Jake had put on it. That was this, like, I don't know if it'll come across on Zoom, but it's this like orbital plugin. So just kind of referencing a few of those things.
What's the track, Mike?
It's the fourth one. Drifting.
Oh God, my internet's being slow. Drifting.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. You guys found it? Cool.
Cool.
There we go.
You use
So,
some
yeah.
of Jolene's director's voice in your music there, Mike?
There was a bunch of voices in it. Just to give kind of a little bit of a rundown of some of the things in there. What I did for it is I took the brass and I essentially just had them play crescendos and then reversed it. So I had them play, and then kind of the decay is just that in the hall. So then that's what we hear is this sort of very quick crescendo into this full brass sound that then sort of decays back down. And then little bits and pieces that are like in like both orchestrated kind of textures, evolving textures, and sort of processed ones. So one is just something like having, sort of midway through or so, there's, kind of like arpeggiando in the sort of solo violin that then gets taken over by the rest of the violins. And so it's sort of like this blend from one to many. And then there was a bunch of like wild textures that I had recorded with the choir. So it was a 9-piece female choir. And there was some overtone singing for that was then kind of mixed in and sort of processed at the end, which, if you guys remember from the sessions, was a bit hilarious because it just kind of sounded like a lot of cats. And and they were kind of, the singers themselves were sort of pissing themselves because it was a bit ridiculous. So as a note to the future, I mean, it works and I like the texture. It's a cool one, but overtone singing is much easier to achieve for men than it is for women. And so I had thought, oh, this is an easy texture because one of my friends who is a choral conductor and a bit of a singer, he can do it. And if he's not a professional singer, then professional singers should be able to. But then the women in the session found it very difficult. And there was like, luckily, one person who could kind of teach the rest of them. But yeah, so there was a few things. And then also the soprano, I mean, the whole track is essentially a sax solo. And I recorded it in the harp booth because there was no harp. So I could sort of put them in the isolation booth and have it on its own. And then in post, Jake Jackson, who mixed it, he had the idea to put this kind of orbital plugin on it. So not just sort of panning going left and right, but it's actually sort of a 360 effect. So it's especially if you're listening on headphones, you can hear it sort of going around your head a bit. So yeah, there was a few things in that. But I also tried to incorporate a lot of these textures, like even with the strings in the beginning, having that sort of come in. There's like a mix of very synthy strings. And so there's this kind of blend between the real and these fake ones that are intentionally not like string samples. They're meant to sound quite processed. And so it's kind of a blend between those textures.
Mike,
That's
I love
nice
the
job.
like growly synth bass sound that's at like 30 seconds. Do you remember how you made that? I want that.
If you've got a Korg monologue, I could give you the preset.
Ah, okay. So it's an analog boy. Oh, very nice.
Yeah, so that's
Sounds fantastic.
Thanks. That's one that I made on the monologue. And yeah, it's fun. Kind of. I mean, I'm sort of was once a bass player, and I love playing with sort of bass synth sounds. So yeah, that's fun.
That reminds me, I saw an advert for what's it called? Ashlight. Native Instruments looks really cool. Just incidentally, it reminded me.
What is it?
It's like it's just a VST synth thingy, but it's got a very kind of intuitive GUI. That means you can. It's like I think it's a granular synth.
I can definitely recommend the monologue for anybody who, it's my sort of first synth. And for anybody who's like daunted by getting into it, it's a pretty affordable one. And it's also really accessible. Like the interface on it is really easy to kind of understand. So you can sort of see what you're doing and affecting without getting kind of lost. Like, oh no, I turned the knob and now I'll never get back to the sound I was at. So that's, I love it. It's a great one. I used it kind of all over that album.
We didn't have Alessandro to sow the seeds of obsession
Yeah, forget
this
it.
one.
His,
He's
all
got a
of his
proper rig.
modules.
We'll have to get him on just to have a whole episode talking about it.
Yeah, we should
Yeah.
do it. You should do like a Cribs feature of his modular rack.
Creative
That would be
Cribs
good.
sounds good.
Yeah. Cool, guys.
All right,
Well,
let's
thanks for joining
advance.
us.
Yeah,
See you
pleasure.
next week.
Cheers, guys.
Bye, everyone.